In a move that has sent shockwaves through the American political landscape, President Donald Trump has recently declared his intent to deploy federal troops to several major United States cities. This declaration comes amidst a period of significant social unrest and protest, which has gripped the nation for several months. The president has cited rising crime rates and the inability of local governments to maintain order as the primary justifications for this unprecedented action. Cities like Chicago, Baltimore, Los Angeles have been specifically named as potential sites for this federal intervention, creating a tense standoff with local and state officials. The president's rhetoric has been forceful, framing the issue as one of restoring law and order to streets he claims have been abandoned to chaos. This situation did not emerge from a vacuum. The current climate of protest, initially sparked by incidents of police brutality, has evolved into a broader movement challenging systemic inequalities. While many demonstrations have been peaceful, some have seen property damage and violent confrontations, which have been heavily publicized and become a focal point of the administration's narrative. President Trump has consistently criticized the leadership of Democratic-run cities, accusing mayors and governors of being too weak to quell the unrest. This has led to his assertion that federal action is not just an option, but a necessity for the protection of citizens and property, thereby setting the stage for a constitutional and political clash of immense proportions. The most visible early example of this policy was the deployment of various federal agents and National Guard troops in Washington, D.C. The sight of military-style vehicles and uniformed personnel on the streets of the nation's capital was a startling image for many Americans and international observers alike. This was followed by the controversial deployment of federal agents, including those from the Department of Homeland Security, to Portland, Oregon, often against the explicit wishes of local officials. These actions were seen by many as a trial run for the broader deployment of active-duty military troops testing the legal and political boundaries of federal power within sovereign states. The core of the president's argument rests on the idea that when a city or state is unwilling or unable to secure its own territory, the federal government has a superseding responsibility to step in. The American system of government is built upon the principle of federalism. Federalism divides power between the national government and the individual state governments. This structure was a deliberate choice by the founders who feared concentrated authority. Under this model, states are traditionally responsible for their own internal affairs. That includes local law enforcement and the maintenance of public order. The federal government's powers are meant to be limited to those explicitly granted by the Constitution. For example, national defense and regulating interstate commerce. President Trump's plan to send troops into cities directly challenges this balance. It suggests a federal role in policing traditionally reserved for states and municipalities. Central to the legal debate is the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. The law explicitly prohibits the use of the United States Army for domestic law enforcement, and by extension the Air Force is also generally barred, unless expressly authorized by the Constitution or an act of Congress. The law was passed during the Reconstruction era specifically to end using federal soldiers to supervise elections and to stop federal troops enforcing laws in the former Confederate states. It reflects a long American tradition separating military functions from civilian policing. The spirit of the law is to prevent the federal military, built to fight foreign enemies, from being used against the American people. Using the military against citizens is seen as a hallmark of authoritarian regimes. However, the Posse Comitatus Act is not an absolute prohibition. There are important exceptions. The most significant is the Insurrection Act. Recent court decisions have provided a complex and sometimes murky landscape regarding the president's power to deploy troops domestically. The judiciary has historically been very cautious about intervening in matters of military authority and presidential national security powers, often deferring to the executive branch. When these powers intersect with civil liberties on American soil, courts have been more willing to step in and define the boundaries. There has not been a direct Supreme Court ruling on the Insurrection Act in the modern era of protest, leaving much of the legal interpretation to older precedents and the specific facts of any new case that might arise. National Guard troops who operate under a different legal status than active-duty military courts have generally given governors wide latitude. In the 1990s, the Supreme Court affirmed the federal government's power over the National Guard for federal missions. But state-level deployments for civil disturbances are typically initiated by governors, The recent use of federal agents in Portland, Oregon, led to several lawsuits. A federal judge did issue a temporary restraining order limiting the actions of federal agents against journalists and legal observers. But the broader question of their right to be there in the first place was not definitively settled, as the administration argued they were protecting federal property, a clear federal function. One of the most significant modern cases that touched upon these themes was Laird v. Tatum in 1972. In this case, the Supreme Court considered a lawsuit challenging the Army's surveillance of civilian political activity. The court ultimately dismissed the case, ruling that the plaintiffs could not show they had suffered any specific harm and that the mere existence of the surveillance program did not create a justiciable controversy. This ruling established a high bar for challenging domestic military activities, suggesting that courts are reluctant to act preemptively and will only intervene when a direct injury has occurred. This precedent could make it difficult for cities or individuals to legally block a troop deployment before it happens. Should President Trump choose to invoke the Insurrection Act, any legal challenge would likely move through the courts with unprecedented speed, creating a landmark decision that would set a powerful precedent for generations to come. The issue of deploying military forces within the United States has exposed deep ideological fissures that now shape American politics. For many conservatives, the president's proposal is viewed through the lens of law and order. Their primary duty of government: ensure the safety of citizens, secure private property. They see protests, especially rioting and looting, as a breakdown of order. If local officials fail, the federal government has the right, and some say obligation, to intervene. That intervention could include the military to restore stability and project strength. Moderates and centrists are conflicted, torn between competing values. On one hand, public safety and an end to violence. On the other, respect for institutional norms and federalism. U.S. troops on American streets feel unsettling, evoking instability and authoritarianism. Moderates favor de-escalation, dialogue, police reform, better resources rather than a heavy-handed military intervention. Liberals view the proposal as an alarming escalation and a threat to civil liberties. They see protests as legitimate responses to systemic injustice, police brutality. Using the military would be like using instruments of war against citizens exercising First Amendment rights. Liberals warn of a chilling effect on dissent, disproportionate force, more violence, and eroded trust. One side sees preservation of the nation, the other sees tyranny. Any presidential move will draw fervent support and fierce opposition. Looking toward the immediate future, the nation stands at a crossroads. Several possible outcomes hang in the balance. One possibility: rhetoric as a political strategy for an election year designed to energize his base and project an image of strength without deploying active duty troops. The threat becomes pressure on local leaders and dominates the news cycle. But the administration stops short of invoking the Insurrection Act, avoiding a massive legal and constitutional crisis. A second possibility: the president follows through, invokes the Insurrection Act, and orders troops into a city against the will of its mayor and against the will of its governor. It would trigger an immediate and chaotic constitutional showdown. State officials challenge the deployment in court. The sight of American soldiers on city streets could quell the unrest or, more likely, provoke an intense backlash from protesters, leading to violent confrontations and a tragic loss of life. This path risks damaging the relationship between the military and the civilian population it is sworn to protect. Regardless of which path is taken, the long-term implications are profound. The debate has already normalized using the U.S. military for domestic law enforcement. Future presidents may feel emboldened to consider this option, having seen the precedent set in 2025. This could lead to a gradual erosion of the posse comitatus principle and a fundamental shift in the American federalist system. Ultimately, the crisis forces Americans to confront fundamental questions about their democracy. Where is the line between maintaining order and suppressing dissent? What are the proper roles of local, state, federal governments in a time of crisis? And what is the place of the world's most powerful military within its own nation's borders? The answers are not simple, and the way they are resolved in the coming weeks and months will shape the character of the American Republic for the foreseeable future.